Our next discussion presentation is about Bitcoin mining. Those of you somewhat new to Bitcoin, you may have heard, you may know there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoin, but all of those Bitcoin were not created or mined at the very beginning of when the network started back in 2009. Currently, there have only been 19.9 million Bitcoin actually created. That is a little over 94% of all Bitcoin that will ever be are now circulating out in the world. And how Bitcoin is created is about every 10 minutes, there is a computer, a miner somewhere in the world that solves a puzzle, and they are awarded the opportunity to add a set of transactions as a block to the end of the blockchain. That is what the blockchain is. And then for providing that service to secure the network and validate transactions, they are awarded a block reward, which at the beginning was 50 Bitcoin. Every 10 minutes to a miner, a computer somewhere around the world. It sounds like a lot, but it really wasn't worth very much at the time. And then in 2012, there was the first halving. That mining reward went from 50 to 25 Bitcoin. The network kept going. 2012 was the second halving. 2016 was the second halving. The miner reward went from 25 to 12.5. Then in 2020, it went from 12.5 to 6.25, and then in 2024, just last year, that mining reward went down to 3.125 Bitcoin. So every 10 minutes, there are about 3.125 Bitcoin that are created and awarded to a miner, and that halving schedule will continue up until the last Bitcoin has been mined, which right now is somewhere around the year 2140 or something like that. So miners play a critical role in the Bitcoin network. And so our next presenter, discusser person, is going to be talking a little bit about the current state of Bitcoin mining. This is Colin Harper. Colin Harper is currently the editor-in-chief at Blockspace Media, in which he publishes deep dive reporting on Bitcoin and hosts community gatherings. Colin also writes for Forbes, in which he analyzes public miner strategies, policy, and technical innovation. And Colin's presentation is Then and Now, Bitcoin Mining in the Fourth Halving Epoch. So thank you, Colin.
Thank you, Shane. Appreciate it. And so as Shane said, I'm editor-in-chief of Blockspace Media. We're a Bitcoin industry publication. We cover a lot of the stories that maybe the traditional media or legacy crypto media miss. We cover Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin markets, Bitcoin tech in general. So as Shane said, we're going to be talking about Bitcoin mining in the fourth halving epoch. I consider the first epoch, the Genesis epoch with the 50 Bitcoin reward. So we're currently in the fourth halving epoch. And for this presentation, I was really trying hard to narrow my focus, but I wanted to kind of give a perspective of where Bitcoin mining was in the early days and how far the industry has come, because it's really become something that was the domain of garage shop hobbyists in the early days. Now it is an industrial scale, heavily capitalized industry. So I'm going to try to go over this quick. Most of y'all probably already know this. If you don't, this will be a helpful primer for explaining what Bitcoin mining is. So what is Bitcoin mining? Bitcoin mining, first off, to understand it, you have to understand that it is a lottery and not any sort of math competition. I think that the legacy media has kind of clung to this idea that miners are basically trying really quickly to solve this crazy math competition, but ultimately what they're doing is they're just guessing hundreds of trillions of numbers every second. And today they use specialized hardware to do this. They used to do it on their CPUs or GPUs. We'll get into some of that history in a minute. Once a miner finds the right number that is below the current difficulty threshold, they win the next block. Now, Bitcoin's difficulty adjustment is one of the kind of pristine inventions or discoveries that really makes it work. How do you make sure that blocks come in at a programmatic schedule if it's a decentralized network and there's no one controlling the issuance of each block? You basically create the difficulty adjustment, which says, okay, if blocks are coming in too quickly because there are too many miners on the network, every 2 weeks or every 2016 blocks, roughly 2 weeks, the difficulty will increase to make it harder to find the next block. If there are too few miners on the network and they're not finding blocks quickly enough, then it'll decrease to make it easier to find the next block after the next difficulty adjustment. And what this does is it ensures that Bitcoin's issuance and block schedule will be more or less within an average of 10 minutes. And it ensures that no miner can capture so much hash rate that they end up having an outsized share of the network. And as Shane covered, Bitcoin's subsidy halves every 210,000 blocks, or roughly 4 years. This also ensures a programmatic reduction of the Bitcoin supply, but it also creates a really nasty revenue shock for Bitcoin miners. Imagine if you're running a business and every 4 years your revenue immediately gets cut in half. So this creates a lot of incentives in the mining industry to scale up, get new infrastructure, get new hardware that is more efficient and more powerful. And it's kind of led to a lot of the commoditization and industrialization that we see in the Bitcoin mining industry, especially as Bitcoin's price has risen. Bitcoin's price goes up, more people are incentivized to mine, hash rate goes on the network, difficulty rises, then it becomes less profitable than before all that hash rate was online. But the Bitcoin mining ecosystem with all of these different parts, the halving and the difficulty adjustment, creates this kind of like constant flux of equilibrium where the network is trying to find how much hash rate can it support while the miners are still profitable. And as you'll see, when Bitcoin's price goes down, transaction fees go down, halving hits, you'll see typically hash rate will dip for a period until the network finds that equilibrium. Miners get new equipment that's more efficient and can produce Bitcoin more profitably. So this is just a little diagram I put together when I was at Luxor. It's a Bitcoin mining software and services company for the hash rate index data platform, and it just shows the halving schedule. So you can see it's increasingly dwindling, and it's just crazy to me to think that the one is cut off at the 2140 mark there at the bottom. But towards the end of Bitcoin's life cycle, miners will be competing for just Satoshis, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. So why does Bitcoin mining exist? You'll often hear, especially after Ethereum moved to proof of stake, some detractors or people who think that it's wasteful or don't like Bitcoin mining's electricity consumption. They'll say, well, why doesn't Bitcoin just move to proof of stake? I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because you could honestly have a whole presentation for why proof of work is superior for censorship resistance and decentralization than proof of stake. But Bitcoin mining aligns economic incentives. Bitcoin miners are economically incentivized to maintain the ledger. They are the blockchain's custodians, and I mean that in the janitorial sense, not the financial sense. They order transactions into blocks and receive transaction fees for their services. So there are two forms of revenue. You get newly mined Bitcoin from each new block that you mine. Right now it's 3.125, but you also get transaction fees on top of that. Transaction fees will eventually be the majority of miner revenue, at least we hope so, if Bitcoin's in a good place. But right now it's a very small amount. It's like 1% of the revenue that they bring in. If miners jeopardize Bitcoin by playing games like colluding to pool hash rate to either reorg or rewrite the chain, they imperil their own source of income. And now these miners are heavily capitalized. They've invested millions of dollars, especially the industrial scale ones, sometimes upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars into these facilities. They are not incentivized to do anything that would discredit Bitcoin or harm its reputation. If they do that, Bitcoin's price could go down, they imperil their entire revenue stream, their business is basically kaput. So in summation, Bitcoin mining allows for a neutral, incentive-aligned party to process transactions without ever taking custody and introduces newly mined coins into the market. So Bitcoin miners simultaneously make sure the ledger is maintained by processing transactions and making sure the transaction flow is continuing. They also introduce newly mined Bitcoin supply into the market because they're often selling that Bitcoin to cover their electricity costs, their capital costs, etc. So this is a chart of Bitcoin's hash rate. If anyone has been watching this over the last few years, obviously you'll notice it's going parabolic. Part of that is because Bitcoin's price is going up, but ASIC hardware, the mining machines that are used to mine Bitcoin now, are becoming increasingly more powerful. They have kind of exponential gains in terms of their ability to produce compute and also in terms of their efficiency with which they transmute electrons into that computation. But I wanted to show this chart to kind of break down some of the different periods we've seen in Bitcoin mining to contextualize where we were and where we are now. So when Satoshi launched Bitcoin and mined the Genesis block, at the time, only CPU miners were used to mine Bitcoin. So you would fire up your desktop, your laptop, and you would run your CPU, your processing unit, to mine Bitcoin. This was all shaken up in 2010 when a man named Laszlo Hanyek, who most of y'all probably know as the Bitcoin pizza guy, introduced GPU mining. He was the first developer on Bitcoin to roll out a Mac OS client for Bitcoin Core. Shortly after, he introduced mining with a graphics card unit. He discovered that you could use your graphics card and produce like 10x the number of hashes that you would get on a CPU. And this really was the flame that sparked what I would consider the proto-industrialization of Bitcoin mining. After GPU mining was introduced, and with the Silk Road market run up in 2010, 2011, you'll see that Bitcoin's price starts moving very volatilely as the Silk Road starts getting off the ground, the dark web marketplace. Now suddenly, miners are incentivized to buy GPUs and set up rigs, maybe in their garages, maybe in their attics, bonus rooms, wherever. And you start seeing a smaller version of the large-scale Bitcoin mines that we see today, but only using GPUs. And so this completely changes the game. You see Bitcoin's issuance really ramp up in this time because a lot of hash rate is coming online, blocks are coming online faster. And the halving for 2012 was actually sped up by, I believe, a month or two because of how much hash rate came online with GPU mining. Now, the third shakeup, and this is where we are currently today because there's not been any advancements in terms of the machines used to mine Bitcoin if the chips have improved. ASIC mining was introduced in 2013. This is there's conflicting evidence on this. Canaan Creative is credited with having the first commercially viable ASIC, but I believe there was an ASIC that was introduced in 2012. An ASIC is just is shorthand for application-specific integrated circuit. These are the chips that animate everything from your phones, they're in your cars, they're in your laptops. Basically, any computing device nowadays will have an ASIC chip. But for Bitcoin miners, they are purpose-built specifically to produce hashes. And so ASIC mining kicks off in 2013, and a year or two later, we start to see that China is beginning to dominate the Bitcoin mining market in terms of hardware and hash rate. So most of these machines are still manufactured by Chinese companies. We'll get to that market share a little later on in the slides. But because all of the production capacity was produced in China, a lot of the early industrial scale Bitcoin mining farms that we see were living in China for a long time until the Chinese mining ban, which I'll cover here in a second. And basically, these miners were setting up outside of hydro dams in the Sichuan region. They would migrate into the coal-rich regions of Inner Mongolia and Xinjiang when the wet season would stop and the dry season kicked off. Electricity prices would raise in the hydro regions. They would move to soak up coal fire power that was much cheaper during the dry season. And kind of a tangent, but this created an interesting seasonality pattern for Bitcoin's hash rate, where when the wet season would end, the Chinese miners would unplug, migrate to the coal-rich regions, and then plug back in. And so you would see hash rate dip during those seasonal events. Then came the China mining ban in 2021, and this is the single most important event, I think, for Bitcoin mining in its history, because after the China mining ban, you had a complete shift in operations and capital to the West. The biggest beneficiary of this in terms of an industry standpoint were United States Bitcoin miners. After the 2021 mining ban, you see a lot of hardware, a lot of business onshoring into the US, and that's also when we see a kind of Cambrian explosion of publicly listed Bitcoin miners. Before the China mining ban, I believe there were like 5 or so public Bitcoin miners. Riot, Marathon, Hut 8, Hive, and Bitfarms, I think, were the big ones, and maybe a few others that were smaller. After the 2021 mining ban in China, you just see all of these, you see a bunch of companies come out of the woodwork, raising capital, going public through SPACs, things like that. And the real takeaway from that is once this industry started moving to the US, there was a huge opportunity because we have typically cheap power in a lot of parts of the US. There's also a lot of capital interests for Bitcoin at the time because it was running up in the 2021 bull market. So then you had these kind of incentives to fund these companies, take them public. They often traded at crazy premiums compared to their revenues because they were seen as a play on Bitcoin. Before the Bitcoin ETFs, a lot of these Bitcoin mining stocks were like the primary vehicle for institutional investors to have exposure to the asset. And the knock-on effect of that is now, because of all of that investment and because of the movement to the US is now the center of Bitcoin mining around the world. You know, roughly 35% plus of Bitcoin's hash rate lives in the US, and a lot of it is controlled by some of these public entities. We'll get into that in a second. But I think this is really important for understanding how the Bitcoin mining landscape has shifted over the last few years. And the primary takeaway is the China mining ban really created this influx of investment and industry in the US for Bitcoin mining specifically. So on that note, Bitcoin mining has come a long way, and I want this to kind of set the stage for the rest of our talk, because I'll be going over different pillars of the Bitcoin mining industry, software and services, mainly mining pools. I won't bore y'all with firmware talk and stuff like that. Looking into the public mining and industrialized Bitcoin mining industry, talking about some of those public companies and how they have kind of created a centralization risk within Bitcoin, and also looking at how the ASIC market has completely changed how we approach acquiring machines and what we think about deployment. And one of the threads that I'm going to kind of pluck throughout this on all of these is, as Bitcoin mining has matured, we've seen increasing concentration and centralization along all of these three main points. I'm not going to like fearmonger or scare anyone and say that Bitcoin's going to die because of this, but I do think that there are things worth addressing with regards to potentially existential threats to Bitcoin's properties of creating, of supplying censorship-resistant, permissionless money. So Bitcoin mining has gone from solo miners to mining pools, common computing equipment to ASICs, garage shop setups to multi-megawatt industrial sites, and it's kind of morphed from this cypherpunk experiment that developers would be mining Bitcoin into a process that's being integrated into grid systems, public and private, around the world as a solution to a number of problems. So mining pools, a necessary evil. Apologies if y'all can't read this very well. I know the black against that is maybe a little bit difficult to read. But when we look at the evolution of Bitcoin mining, mining pools are at the center of a lot of what we see in terms of the industrialization and professionalization of the industry today. So Slush Pool, now Brains Pool, was the first mining pool. It launched in 2010 at a time when solo mining was still common. Now over 99.99% of Bitcoin blocks are produced by pools. It's probably even more than that. I could add some nines there. What a mining pool is, and sorry if you already know this, but I want to just cover the bases. A mining pool pools hash rate for multiple users and splits the profits proportionally between participants. So depending on how much hash rate you have of the pool, you will get a payout proportional to your work that you submitted to the pool. FPPS is the most common pool payout. This pool payout means that miners get paid according to an agreed upon market price, which we call hash price in the industry. It's basically, it looks at the block rewards and the value of those block rewards over a given time, and then ends up spitting out a number for how much a unit of hash rate is worth. So right now it's like $59, $60 per petahash per day. And what that means is if you had a 100 terahash miner, you could make $5 to $6 a day in USD mining with one of these pools. FPPS plus, and that plus shouldn't be on the first one, it should be on this PPS one here. This is a moderately common payout method. The FPPS method is the most common. It's almost the same as FPPS, except the transaction fees are not factored into hash price, and they're paid out directly from the blocks. So with FPPS, basically the mining pool just looks at average transaction fees, average value of the block subsidy, and then uses that to derive hash price. For PPS plus, they look at just the block subsidy, and then they will pay out transaction fees from the blocks that the pool mines to pay out their miners. And then PPLNS, the rarest one at this point, is Slush Pool's original model. Miners only earn income when the pool mines a block. So the takeaway from this is PPLNS is probably the best of these payout methods if you want to try to disintermediate any sort of concentration within Bitcoin's hash rate. But the fact of the matter is, most of these Bitcoin miners at this point, like I said, they're industrial scale, these are professional operations. They want consistent revenue, so they're gonna go with FPPS or PPS plus. Because they don't have to worry, okay, my pool was unlucky one day, they should have mined 10 blocks, they mined 5, I have power bills to pay, I can't stomach that kind of fluctuation in my revenue. Obviously, there's the other side of that equation where they should have mined 10 blocks, but they mined 15, but like net, these professional Bitcoin miners don't want that revenue insecurity. They want to make sure that they're going to get paid an agreed upon price for their hash rate. And why am I spending all this time talking about pool payouts? It's because you have to understand those pool payouts to understand the current landscape of mining pools. So many of you have probably seen this chart, similar charts. This is from Hash Rate Index, my former employer, Luxor. Currently, 3 pools control over 50% of Bitcoin's hash rate. The biggest of these pools, at least on paper, and we'll get to that in a second, is Foundry, US company. They service a lot of the public entities, a lot of the big private miners. They have around 28%, or have averaged 28% of the network hash rate over the last week. The second biggest is Ant Pool at 18%. This is Bitmain's Bitcoin mining pool. They're no longer legally tied together, but Bitmain's ecosystem, you'll see they have all of these companies working kind of in the corners and in the shadows, and they all share founders. The share structure is often, it often flows into one company versus the other. And ant pool is really interesting for something that we'll talk about in the next slide, which is proxy pooling. And going back to the breakout of payout methods per Bitcoin mining pool, 70% of mining pools use FPPS versus 12.2% for PPS plus. PPLNS is like 0.2% of the network at this point. It would be much more, but Brains went off of that model, I believe, a year or two ago. And it was actually for the same reason that I was talking about before. One of their biggest customers, Riot, basically ended up leaving the pool because they were not making as much revenue as they could have with FPPS. So then after that, Brains moved to FPPS. There goes the last big PPLNS pool in Bitcoin mining. So I have parentheses here that says the PPS plus share is likely higher. And the reason for that is what we call proxy pooling. Some people call it proxy mining. There's not like a defined term for it. Without getting too much into the technical details, proxy pooling is where a Bitcoin mining pool will go to another mining pool and actually sell their hash rate that they have under management in that pool. So if I point to pool A and give them my hash rate, pool A might be using that hash rate to sell to another big pool like Ant Pool. I'm kind of singling out Ant Pool right now because they've been one of the more obvious and egregious practitioners of this. But up here is a diagram that shows the Merkle trees for a block. And what this basically shows, without getting into the technicals of what Merkle trees are, if you see all of these numbers and colors aligned, that means that all of those pools are using the same block template. So what mining pools do is when you give them their hash rate, you're not actually selecting the transactions you want to go into that block. You are basically contracting them to do that for you. And so when a mining pool takes hash rate, they're going to build a block template for all their miners. And once one of their miners guesses the right number, they are going to use the block template that they used for the transactions that they picked. So when you see something like this, where all of those numbers and all of those colors, this is from stratum.work. It's a great live feed for blocks that are coming in at real time. That means that all of those pools are using the same block template. The only way that that is conceivably possible, unless you're just very optimistic about coincidences, is the fact that those pools are going to Ant Pool and saying, here's our hash rate, build our block templates for us, and pay us X amount for the hash rate. Now, you might be asking why pools do this. The simplest reason is because if a pool is smaller, sometimes it's better for them to sell that hash rate to a bigger pool because they don't have to worry about whether or not they're going to win a block. Because remember, FPPS pools are assuming all of the risk for miners. They are paying out their miners regardless of how often they win a block. This works great if they're very lucky. If they need to pay out 10 blocks but they win 15, then they're going to capture that delta and earn revenue on that. But if they're unlucky and they have a long span of being unlucky for mining blocks, then they're going to make less revenue because they still have to pay out their miners an agreed upon price for their hash rate. But they're not earning 10 blocks worth of Bitcoin. They're earning maybe 5. So they will offload some of this hash rate to some of these other pools to try to make sure that they also have revenue certainty. The other reason, and this can't really be proved out because there's no way to verify this unless you actually ask the pools involved. But some of these pools, like Ant Pool, might do dirty things like block withholding attacks. So what this is Ant Pool could theoretically allocate maybe 10% of its hash rate to a competitor pool. And let's say that hash rate that Ant Pool controls but is pointing towards that pool, let's say they win a block, but they decide to withhold it from that pool. They can basically win a block, but maybe they just don't let the pool have it. Well, then that pool then wins a block. They don't get the revenue for it. They still have to pay out all of their pool participants. And so this creates an incentive where they are basically almost blackmailing the other pools to join their pool so that they can have that hash rate. And there's some great literature on that online. Definitely recommend looking into that because there's some blockchain sleuths that have broken it down in kind of a better way than I can do with the limited time I have now. But just to reiterate one last thing on this, basically what this means is that a pool like Ant Pool could conceivably have a lot more hash rate than what they're reporting because they have all of these other pools that are pointing towards them. Now, when they publish these blocks, they are going to sign the block with that pool's label. So if mining pool A is pointing its hash rate towards ant pool, when they publish that block, they're going to say mined by mining pool A, even though ant pool was building that template. All of that to say, there is a large quantity of Bitcoin's hash rate that's actually pointing towards ant pool on any given day. Sometimes the mining pools change. But this obviously creates a centralization risk because you have even more concentration within a single pool than you would otherwise have if miners weren't proxy pooling. All right, moving on to the next part, which is Bitcoin mining is a gigawatt game now. Remember, I was mentioning how in the early days, most of the miners, I mean all the miners really until ASICs, were mining from their homes. They didn't, take out PPAs. They weren't building big industrial sites. But now, as you can see, with the Riot Rockdale facility in the top right there, and also with one of Iron's Bitcoin mines in the bottom, these Bitcoin mines now are massive. They draw hundreds of megawatts. I believe Rockdale is about 400 megawatts total, and they exist in these massive, what they call cathedrals in the data center industry. And you walk into one of these things, and there's just, all the way down the horizon line, there are Bitcoin mines on racks. I love Bitcoin mining. I'm always going to love it. But I got to be honest, anytime I visit an industrial mine, I can't help but think, I don't know if this is the way we want this done, man. There's something that seems kind of weird about this. So going back to the China mining ban, like I said, that thrust a lot of Bitcoin miners into public markets in the US, and the axis of influence shifted from China to the US, both for hash rate concentration and for capital allocation. Access to US capital markets, like I said earlier, created an explosion of development and a mushroom of publicly traded companies. US listed public miners now account for 30% of Bitcoin's hash rate, another centralization risk that we'll touch in a second. Bitcoin mining is now a professionalized industrial scale industry. Opportunities still exist for smaller scale operations. You'll find 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 megawatt facilities that can get PPAs, but a lot of these are increasingly pushed to the fringes to access competitive electricity costs. It's a lot easier for someone with 100 megawatts to go into ERCOT and get a favorable rate versus someone who has one megawatt. But so behind the meter renewables, stranded gas, recycled heating, all of these edge cases are ways that smaller miners can find ways to reduce their costs to remain viable. So this is a chart from JP Morgan that shows the share of network hash rate by US listed miners. Now, a caveat on this does not include just US facilities. Some of these US listed companies have operations all around the world. They can be in Paraguay, they can be in Norway, Iceland, Finland. But US listed miners, as of May, currently operate 31.5% of Bitcoin's hash rate. And if we look even more recently, Mara, Iron, Kingo, and CleanSpark, the first 4 companies to hit 50 exahashes. The Bitcoin network currently is about 900 exahashes a second. That's a 7-day average of that. They operate about 22% of Bitcoin's hash rate. So why am I talking about network hash rate share for public miners? Well, this creates a centralization risk because if you look at the US has a vested interest in making sure that transactions do not exist outside of the white market. So you could theoretically go to public miners and you could tell them any of these addresses that are on our sanctions list, you cannot include in your blocks. The same thing goes for Foundry, which is the kind of the blue chip regulated US mining pool. They could go to Foundry and say, these transactions absolutely cannot be in your blocks, and if they are, then you are in violation of US sanctions. And there you go, then you have these Bitcoin mining entities filtering out however many transactions that would be. Obviously, there are more mining pools around the world and there are more miners. Eventually, those transactions would get through. But if you have 30% of the network not processing 10% of the transactions, that creates a bottleneck for people who are trying to use Bitcoin. So basically, these public miners and even the mining pools themselves kind of create a bottleneck and a centralization risk because regulators, if they wanted to, because these are pretty buttoned up companies at this point, could go to them and say these transactions are not legally valid. A few headwinds for the Bitcoin mining industry in the US, just to talk about where I kind of see the industry going. I wouldn't be surprised if over the next 4 years we see Bitcoin mining kind of drain out of the US, or at least its market share start to recede. Reason for this, AI and HPC demand is outstripping electricity supply. More than half of the major public miners have announced AI or HPC plans. They want to create data centers and host HPC tenants like we've seen with CoreSci and CoreWeave. Right now, Core Scientific, Riot, IRN, Bit Digital, Cypher, BitDeer, Hut 8, Hive, TeraWolf, among others, have announced AI and HPC plans or are actively retrofitting facilities or building facilities for AI compute. The other big headwind is the US has not meaningfully added electricity generating capacity in 20 years. This is one of my favorite charts to reference where we're at in terms of our energy landscape, because you can see at about 2000, our energy electricity capacity in the US kind of just plateaus. We started decommissioning a lot of coal fire plants, firing up renewables, and we have not really meaningfully built out base load, so things like nuclear, hydro, nat gas that is needed to sustain a operation like Bitcoin mining, which requires constant uptime. And the last pillar that I want to talk about is the ASIC market. Bitcoin mining has evolved to these highly specialized hardwares called ASICs. The efficiency increases are quite dramatic from the S21 to the S23, which are the S23 is the current leading machine from Bitmain, the largest manufacturer in the world. S21 was the prior generation. The S21 to S23 saw a 30% efficiency and 60% hash rate boost. Miners, going back to what I was saying about the industrialization of Bitcoin mining and the halving schedule and difficulty adjustment, they're incentivized within reason to purchase new ASICs as quickly as possible so that they can get more efficient, more powerful hash rate online so that they can beat out their competition. The leading manufacturers, Bitmain and MicroBT, sell billions of dollars in hardware each year, and deploying ASICs is capital intensive, going back to the public miners, but there's a high depreciation on these machines, anywhere from 3 to 5 years. Revenue is very volatile in this industry. Bitcoin can go down, the halving can happen, difficulty can rise dramatically as hash rate comes on overnight. It makes debt too expensive for a lot of these companies. So you've seen a lot of public miners default towards equity to raise, so that you typically will dilute shareholders through at-the-market offerings or other equity placements. And that's been the primary vehicle. This is changing a little bit. Convertible notes are becoming much more common, I think largely because the Bitcoin ETFs have just opened up more capital flows into the industry. So this is a chart from Coinmetrics that shows the market share of all of these different companies. Coinmetrics has a thing called Mine Match where they look at the nonce patterns of all these different miners, and they can kind of give an idea for how many of each machine is on the network. And as you can see from this, Bitmain just absolutely dominates. And between Bitmain and MicroBT, they capture 90% of the ASIC market. Another centralization risk that I think is less important than the mining pool and industrial scale mining one, for a number of reasons that I won't get into in depth, but Bitmain does a lot of things in the industry that a lot of miners don't like, but they're not really incentivized to sell you crappy machines or sabotage those machines, because then they will risk their business. All right, I'm running up on time here, so I'm going to close on a few slides to give a global perspective of Bitcoin mining. So the top 5 countries by hash rate, this is again from Luxor and Hash Rate Index. The US currently captures about 36% according to Luxor's estimates, Russia at 17%, China at 14%, Paraguay at 4%, and the UAE at 3.5%. This is an estimate. This is based on a methodology, based on publicly available documents from public miners, also Luxor business data. It's really hard to get an accurate depiction of this. Cambridge has one as well, and they use mining pool data to give an estimate of where hash rate is in the US. The problem with that is if you run a Bitcoin mine in Paraguay, but you're based in the US, when you log into your mining pool dashboard, it's going to log you as being in the US, and they're going to say, okay, well, this guy has an exahash in the US when actually it's in Paraguay. All right, 3 case studies to close on. I think these are really cool to show, like I said earlier, how Bitcoin mining is increasingly being integrated into grids and public and private utilities. This is a site in Kenya from Gridless, and what this site does is it monetizes otherwise wasted energy from a microgrid in Kenya. And what this allows the utility to do is they are now making more revenue because they can actually sell more electricity than they were before, and all of this is excess. They can then reinvest that revenue into electrical infrastructure to electrify the neighboring villages. Another really cool one is from one of my buddies, Jaren Mellerud at Hash Labs. They are heating water for homes in Finland. So Finland have these district heating facilities where they basically heat all the water centrally and then pipe it to the city. It's not very efficient. Usually they use coal, natural gas, biomass. Now, Hash Labs has deployed Bitcoin miners, hydro Bitcoin miners, that heat up the water and send it into the city center. And the last one that I always thought was really cool is Bitcoin mining in the oil field. So roughly 140 billion cubic meters of gas is flared annually. That's enough to heat 33 million homes. Flared gas usually has no path to market. Costs prohibit oil and gas firms from selling it profitably. But Bitcoin miners can come in, consume this natural gas on site, reduce flared and vented methane emissions, and mine Bitcoin and monetize energy that otherwise would have been wasted. And that's it. Thank you all for listening. You can find me on Twitter at @AsILayHodling, Blockspace Media at Blockspace Pod. You can find all of our podcasts from the Mining Pod, which is one of the pods we run at Blockspace, on YouTube and wherever you listen. And you can also follow the Mining Pod on Twitter. Find all of our articles and other content on blockspace.media as well. Do we have time for a few questions?
Yeah, we do have time for like one question.
Okay.
If anyone would like, anyone have a question?
Are you optimistic at all about heat reuse unlocking more like decentralized consumer level?
In short, yes. It's a really interesting case study. So like in the example you're using, I've known guys who have basically set up either an immersion or a hydro unit and used it to heat their water for their homes. Also know guys who have taken air-cooled ASICs, put it into the ductwork, and then it heats their homes in the winter with all the hot air from the Bitcoin miners. I think it's a really cool use case. I think it's gonna take really good consumer hardware to do that, because you still have to be like pretty savvy and kind of have an engineering mind to just rig one of those up yourselves. I'm not optimistic about it totally disrupting some of the centralization, just because two problems. One, like you're probably not going to have as many people doing that as you're going to have heavily capitalized companies buying tens of thousands of ASICs and deploying them at scale. The other thing is too, it doesn't really solve the mining pool centralization issue, because like you're not going to be solo mining with that. Maybe you'll use Ocean or one of the other pools that is trying to solve this problem, but you're still going to point that hash rate somewhere. And if you're pointing it to Antpool or one of the other ones, that doesn't really help with that. But in the right circumstances, I think it could help.
Do you think Bitaxes is going to do more for that? Because those are more solo mining, or not even?
So for Bitaxes, for those who don't know, those are typically, they're small-scale ASICs that produce like anywhere from 1 to 4 terahashes. A current Bitcoin miner, like a newest generation, is like 318. Like in a perfect world, if enough people were running them, it could make a dent. But you would have to get a lot of people running them. I mean, I think the last time I ran the numbers, is like you need to get like at least 1 million people mining on a Bitaxe to be able to even produce a block a day that would be valid, right? So I don't think that it's going to make a meaningful difference. That being said, still really cool project, and I kind of recommend those as well as running your own Raspberry Pi node, right? Because it's a really good teaching mechanism for how a lot of these things work. So.
All right. Thank you, Colin.